Good evening. We are going to be in Genesis chapter 25 tonight. Genesis chapter 25. You know, we see throughout the Bible that what God is looking for is people who depend upon Him, who turn to Him in time of need. And the reason for that is really well shown in this passage in Genesis, that where we have Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and then their two boys, their twins, Esau and Jacob. And in the times when they depend on God, things work out really well, but they are kind of a picture-perfect case, almost a sitcom kind of family of when they depend on themselves, the chaos that can come from that. And so we're starting in Genesis chapter 25 and in verse 19, where we see right from the start this kind of big difference between how Isaac and Rebekah handle things and then how their children handle things. And it starts with Isaac. He has a problem, and his problem is he knows that he's supposed to have a child. Abraham had been promised he would be a great nation, and eventually Abraham had Isaac. And so if that promise is going to continue, then Isaac knows he's got to have a child of his own, but it's been 20 years since he married Rebekah, and they still don't have a child. And so in his time of trouble, he turns to God. It says he pleads with God for Rebekah, and they conceive, and she has a child. And so when he turns to God, things work out really well. Rebekah has a problem now. She's pregnant, but there's something about it that isn't quite right. And maybe she heard other women talk about pregnancy, but there was just something about it that didn't seem to fit. And so in her time of trouble, she turns to the Lord and she asks, what is wrong with this baby? What's going on? And so God helps her to understand. He says it's not just one, but that you're having two babies. And he prophesies about them. And he says ultimately that the younger, or that the older will serve the younger, which is out of order for ancient people. They almost always thought of the oldest as being the one in charge. But he says in this case, the older is going to serve the younger. And so she has her answer. Her babies are fine. It's just that there's two of them. And she conceives and she gives birth to these two babies, and everything goes well. Now, compare that to how Esau and Jacob handle things. They both have problems, or at least they feel that they do. Jacob's problem is that he wants to be the firstborn son. That's what he wants. And so you can call that a problem, or you can just call it a wish, or whatever you want. Maybe he's heard the prophecy, maybe he hasn't, I don't know. But for whatever reason, that's what he wants. And so he's looking for an opportunity to make that happen. Esau's problem is that he has, we've all kind of had that before, where you just get so hungry, you feel like you're dying. He's been out hunting all day, and he comes back, and he feels like he's got to eat right now. And so Jacob has made this delicious, probably smelling red stew, and Esau says, I have to have some of that, no matter what it takes. And Jacob depends on himself. He turns to his own problem-solving skills, and he says, I'll tell you what, if you will give me your birthright, I'll give you some of this stew. And that's, I don't know. Maybe he knew Esau really well, and he knew this would work. Maybe this is just kind of the guy that Esau was. I tend to think probably it was more just kind of a stab in the dark. It's like, might as well try something, right? And then it just works. I don't know, but either way, when he trusts in himself, we're going to see all of the chaos that comes from this. And Esau, too, I guess his reasoning is, I'm either going to die, and he's going to have my birthright anyway, or I can give him my birthright and eat the stew, and so either way he gets my birthright, but at least I live in one of the scenarios. And, I tend to think, and it doesn't say, I tend to think that he was just sort of hungry and not actually dying. But let's just give them both the benefit of the doubt. Let's just say that Esau was literally, he had been out so long, and he was literally on his deathbed there in front of his brother. Don't you think, if he had just turned to God in that moment and said, my brother is unfairly trying to get me to give him my birthright and withholding food from me, that God could have worked that out. And same thing, if Jacob thought, if he knew about the prophecy or something, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say he knew the prophecy. and he's waiting for, when is that going to come true? When am I going to be treated as the oldest born son, and all of the good things that come with that? If he had just turned to God and said, when are you going to work that out? Or just trusted God to work that out, so many of the problems that were going to come never would have happened. But they don't. They trust in themselves, and they bring problems on their family. Now, chapter 26 is mostly about Isaac. And in Isaac, we see that he makes the same kind of mistakes. But what we see in Isaac is, thank God, there is room for growth. That when we make mistakes like this, there is room for us to overcome that and to grow in our dependence on God. And it begins, as stories in Genesis often do, with a famine. And in fact, what we see in Isaac is, he really is sort of the chip off the old block, as they say. The apple really doesn't fall very far from the tree. It tends to go with Isaac that the way that Abraham handled it, Isaac wants to do it the same way. And so you remember in Genesis chapter 13, there was a famine in the land. And so what did Abraham do? He went down to Egypt to find food. Well, here's a famine in the land, and it seems like that's what Isaac's intention is. My dad went to Egypt, I'll go to Egypt. But God comes to him, and he says, first of all, do not go down to Egypt. I know your dad did that. I don't want you to do that this time. Second, he gives him some promises. He makes him some assurances. He says in verse 2, he says, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. And so he comes, and in essence, he says, if you can be like that, if you can keep all of my commandments and statutes and laws as Abraham did, and we know, we read Abraham's story, he wasn't perfect, but there was grace there. It says, if you can do that, Isaac, then I will continue this promise through you. And in fact, he says, I'll show it to you. There's a famine in the land. Don't leave the land. Just stay here where the famine is. And he says, I will bless you despite this famine. And so verse 6, we're told that Isaac chose to dwell in Gerar. Now, Gerar was in the Philistine territory, but remember, that was supposed to be a part of the promised land. They were supposed to drive the Philistines out of there someday. And so he does. He stays in the land, just chooses to be close to where the Philistines are. But the trouble with that is that he's looking at the Philistines and the king of the Philistines, and he says, just as Abraham did, my wife is beautiful. They're going to kill me because she's too beautiful. Right? That's a real struggle for people, I know, when you have such a beautiful wife. But he says, that this is the trouble. And so, just like Abraham did, he said, I'll just tell a lie. We'll just kind of wiggle our way out of this. Abraham said she's my sister, and so I'm just going to do the same thing. I'll say that she's my close relative and imply that she's nothing more than that to me. And so that seems to work for a moment until the king of the Philistines is walking close to their room, and he looks through a window into their room, and he says that he sees Isaac affectionately touch her, and he thinks to himself, that's not what brothers and sisters do. And so he talks to Isaac about it, and I love the way that he phrases it. He says, obviously, this is verse 9, quite obviously, she is your wife, right? He just kind of calls him on the carpet there. And so Isaac has, and you think about it, God has just told him, stay in this land where there is a famine, and I will bless you despite the famine. Isaac hasn't seen that blessing yet. And so it can be assumed, it can be understood that God is not going to let Abimelech kill Isaac over his wife if he hasn't received the promise of a blessing in time of famine. And so if he had just reasoned through that, he could have understood that he didn't have to lie. He didn't have to do it that way in order to survive this trouble that he perceived that he was in. God would have taken care of him. Just like Abraham, we see that there's a chink in his armor. There's some doubts in his faith. And Abimelech says, it was only a matter of time before we did something inappropriate with your wife. If we hadn't figured this out, how could you do this to us? He caused problems. He hurt the people who were around him because he didn't just turn to God in this time that he perceived as a need. But we see that he grows through this, that this changes him. In verse 12, it talks about how he goes out and he sows the land. Now, there's a famine, which means there's not rain. Nothing is growing, but he decides to trust what God said, and he puts his seeds in the ground, and it comes back 100-fold. That's 100 times what he anticipated being able to produce. There's no rain coming down anywhere. There's nothing growing in the land, and God miraculously gives his crops 100-fold what he put in the ground. And so he sees here God really is able to provide when we just trust and depend on him. Now, because there's no rain coming down, he's looking for water, and he finds one of the old wells that his father Abraham had dug, and they had covered it up, and so he redigs it so that he can have water for his family, for his crops. But maybe it's because of the lies he told the Philistines. Maybe it's just because there's a famine and there's not enough water. But the shepherds of the Philistines come and they try to take over that well. They say, this well is ours. Now, Abraham is the one who dug it originally. Isaac took the time to dig it himself. And, if we're Isaac, maybe we're thinking, someday we're going to own all this land and you won't even be here anymore, right? It all belongs to us. And so that's his well by right. But remember, he does what Abraham does. When Abraham, his shepherds, had conflict with Lot's shepherds over space, Abraham, Lot's not the one who received the promise. He's not the one who is going to inherit all that land. But Abraham says, you choose first so that he can keep the peace. That's what Isaac does. He says, you want that well? It should belong to me, but that's fine. I'll move further away so that you can have the well. And he names the wells as he goes. You see it there in verse 20. There it says, the herdsmen from Gerar came and they said, the water is ours. And so he called the name of the well Esek. Esek is the Hebrew word for quarrel or to fight. And so you see, he pursues peace so that he can end this fight between these people. So he finds another of Abraham's wells and he digs it back out. And everything is good, but here come the Philistines again. And they decide they want this well too. And so he names this one something that means enmity. He pursues peace to end enmity with these people. And he goes and he finds a third well and he digs that well out. And what we see is the reason why he keeps moving on, the reason why he keeps giving these people the wells that really belong to him is because he's learning to trust God's promises. This is verse 22. It says, he called this one's name Rehoboth because he said, for now the Lord has made room for us and we shall be fruitful in the land. He trusted. God said, stay here and I will bless you. He knew he would have the survival with the crops and space somewhere. He began to trust that and to depend on God, to let those other wells go because he knew God would ultimately provide a space for him. And that's what God does here. And you notice it says in verse 24, and the Lord appeared to him that same night. He has that declaration of faith. I knew God would make space for us. And so God comes to him that very night and he says, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you, and I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. And so Isaac, he built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord, and he pitched his tent there, and they dug out that well. And so God comes and he says, because you trusted in me, I continue to bless you. I continue to take care of you. And that's the big difference here. Every time Isaac trusts in himself, there's harm and there's problems, but every time he just depends on God, God just keeps on blessing and blessing and blessing him. And ultimately what happens then, and this is not always the case, but often peacemaking begets peacemaking. Isaac decides to make peace with those Philistines by making more space for them. And so the king of the Philistines comes to him and he says, we can see that God is with you. And we had our trouble back there in the city when you lied to us, but now let's make a covenant together. Let's make an oath so that we can be at peace with one another. And so they do. They make the covenant, and he digs another well, and he names it covenant. It says in verse 33, he said he called it Sheba, and therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. Beersheba becomes one of the major cities in the future when the Israelites live in the land, and that's Beer is the name for well, and then Sheba of covenant. It's the well of covenant that becomes an important place for the Israelites. And it only exists because Isaac chose to depend and to trust on God. Meanwhile, Esau has not learned so much. It says in verse 34, when he was 40 years old, he took his wives, Judith the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. Now, why were they a grief of mind? Maybe, I don't know why Esau chose to marry them. Maybe he saw his father make a covenant with the Philistines and he thought, well, it'd make my father happy if I married women from the Hittites or something like that. I don't know. But the reason why they were a grief of mind is because they come from idol-worshiping families and because their families are so close by. And so now there is this constant worry that Esau is going to be pulled into all of that idol worshiping of his wife's relatives right there. That's the whole reason why Abraham said, do not take Isaac back to my family. When he sent a servant to find a wife, he was concerned about that idolatry. Do not marry anyone from this region, Abraham said. He was concerned about that. And now Esau has not learned to depend on God. He didn't ask his father, who should I marry? He didn't turn to God to figure out which way to go. He just made the choice. And it was a grief of mind, it says, to Isaac and Rebekah. Now, chapter 27 is where all of these consequences really kind of come to. And it's sad, but it's almost comical if you think about it in like sitcom fashion of those families who just mess up everything that they try to do. That's what chapter 27 is they each make their mistakes, and it all just grows and grows into more chaos. Isaac believes that he's dying, maybe because he couldn't see very well. He believes that he's dying. Now, the thing is, he doesn't actually die for more than 20 years. They're going to send Jacob away. Jacob is going to come back 20 years later, and his dad is still alive. And so he hasn't perhaps even gone to God to say, is this my time to die? He's just decided that he's dying, and so he's going to bless his oldest son. That's the normal custom. That's the normal way to do things. And so he sends his son out to find some food. He's a hunter. And to prepare it for him, make me a tasty meal, and I'll give you my blessing. But his wife Rebekah hears about it, and she's not happy. Now, I don't know. I don't know if it's because Rebekah is thinking about that promise from so long ago that the older will serve the younger. Maybe she's thinking about that and thinking, no, he can't give the blessing to Esau. It belongs to Jacob. Or maybe it's just because Jacob is her favorite. We're told that in chapter 25. Jacob was her favorite. And so maybe she's just thinking, I don't want Esau to have it. I want Jacob to have it. But for whatever reason, she's going to do something about this. And so she goes to Jacob and she says, let's trick your dad. Right? I'm going to make a delicious meal. Right? I taught Esau to cook. I know how to make food like he does. I'm going to put some hairy clothes on you so that if he touches you, you feel like your brother. Esau was very hairy. Jacob had smooth skin. We're going to put a coat on you so that if he catches a whiff of you or gets real close, you'll smell like your brother. And so she makes this plan and she moves forward. Jacob agrees to the plan. All right, Mom, if you say it, then we'll do it. And so he goes in. And the thing is, as far as plans go, it works, at least as far as getting what they desired out of it in the moment. It works. Isaac is suspicious because it sounds like Jacob. This is Jacob's voice. I'm not so sure about that. But he feels like Jacob, or like Esau when I touch him, and he smells like Esau when I get close to him, and the food tastes like something Esau had made, and so, all things considered, 3-1, everything points to you being Esau. And so he gives him Esau's blessing. And just as Jacob slips out, Esau comes in and he says, Dad, I did what you said, and I'm ready for my blessing. And Isaac says, I don't have a blessing to give you. But he does bless his oldest son in the end. Especially notice verse 40. Genesis 27 and verse 40. This is the blessing that he gives his oldest son. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother, and it shall come to pass that when you become restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Here's the blessing he gave him. Sibling division, war between their future descendants. Now, that's not much of a blessing, if you ask me. Sibling division and war between their future descendants was all that he had left to give to Esau because of the way that all of these things went down. You think about each one of these people. If during the course of this day, when Rebekah had heard that Jacob or Isaac was going to bless Esau, if she had just turned to God, right? What about that promise? How are you going to work this out, God? He could have worked it out so much differently. If Jacob, when he heard his mother's plan, he said, hold on a minute, Mom, I don't know about tricking Dad, if that's such a good idea. Let's turn to God about this. And God could have said, this is how I plan to work that out, or just trust me and wait, and I will make it all happen. But they trust in themselves, and it creates this division between these two brothers. If Isaac had just stopped and said, you sound like Jacob. Let me turn to God as the head of our family, and that's what the head of the family did. Let me turn to God and ask for guidance in this. God could have told him exactly what was going on, and perhaps God even would have instructed him to give the blessing to Jacob. I don't know how God would have worked it out, but it could have been so much different. And so ultimately, here are all of the things that happen because of their choices. There's the hatred that Esau has for Jacob, and Esau is so angry, it says he was planning, this is verse 41, he was planning to kill Jacob as soon as their father was dead, which they all thought was any day now. And so there's hatred between brothers, and now Jacob has to go back to where Rebekah's family comes from. She has to go back to Rebekah's brother Laban. Now, you remember what Abraham said when he wanted to find a wife for Isaac. He took his most trusted oldest servant, and he said, do not take Isaac back there. Do not send Isaac back to where I came from. I think out of fear that Isaac would either stay or be influenced by the idol worshiping of his family. Do not send Isaac back there. And remember, Isaac does things Abraham's way over and over again. That's been his instinct. And so when it came time to find a bride for Isaac, for all their names just there. When it came time to find a bride for Jacob, what do you think Isaac would have done? He would have found a servant, and he would have said, go back to Laban and find him a bride there and bring her back. Do not take Jacob back there. And so that servant would have gone, and I think probably he would have found one wife for her. Maybe that would have been Leah, or maybe Leah would have been married off already if Jacob had never showed up, and maybe it would have been Rachel anyway. I don't know. But he only would have had the one wife from Laban's household. Think of all the fighting that went on between Leah and Rachel when they're both married to Jacob. Think of all the division and difficulty that they went through because Jacob went there. That could have all been avoided if they hadn't have taken things into their own hands. And so now Jacob spends 20 years separated from his family, thinking probably his father has died and that he'll never see him again. That's 20 years that these people are not together. And all that time, what do you think Isaac and Rebekah are concerned about? The idol worshiping. This is the influence that Jacob is now under. And when Jacob comes back, remember, because they're running away from Laban, what does Rachel steal? The household gods. And she brings them back with him. And years after they return, finally, Jacob buries them in the ground and says, don't dig them back up. But you know what that means? All those decades, there were probably people in Jacob's household maybe even Jacob himself, who were worshiping idols because Jacob went back to where Laban was. It never gives us any indication that Isaac struggled with idol worship because Abraham would not let Isaac go back. All of that could have been avoided if they had just waited on God to work these things out. That's a lot of consequences from just a snap moment kind of judgment. I've got to fix this. And that is the real trouble that we get ourselves into when we jump the gun on God's plans. Sometimes we're just trying to help God out a little bit. Sometimes we're just trying to make things happen that we think that God wants, and we jump the gun on God's plans. We don't just trust that God will work it out or turn to him to figure out what is best to do. We just take action, and the consequences just grow. And, God works it out anyway. He's good at that. He works all of this out despite the fact that they try to take it into their own hands. But wouldn't it be better just to do it his way the first time through and not have to deal with all the consequences? And that's why we see in this section that God truly is seeking people who just trust him, who just rely on him, who turn to him in the difficult times so that we can do it his way and have less of those self-made consequences to deal with. And if we can help you to turn to God tonight, to seek his counsel for things that you are struggling with in your life, we would love to help you do it. And we ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.